7 answers. 7 number 1 answers. Back to back. No misses. No strikes. No hesitation. Not even the half-second pause that most people take when they are deciding between 2 options. She did not decide between options. She knew. By the 4th answer, Steve Harvey had stopped writing on his note card. He held the pen above the paper, and then he slowly set the pen down on the podium. The way you set something down when your hands have found something more interesting to do, which was to hang at his sides and look at this woman like she was a math problem he had not been taught how to solve. By the 5th answer, a woman in the 7th row had grabbed the arm of the stranger sitting next to her. By the 6th, one of the cameramen, a man who had worked 12 seasons of this show and had seen things that would make a highlight reel, slowly lowered his camera an inch because he had forgotten, for one moment, that it was his job to hold it steady. By the 7th answer, Steve Harvey walked over to the board. He stood in front of it. He looked at it for a moment, and then he raised his right hand and knocked on it with his knuckle. 3 times. Knock, 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 like a man checking if a wall is hollow, like someone trying to determine if the thing in front of him is real. The audience lost itself completely. But here is the thing about that moment. The thing that the clip and the comments and the 2 million people who shared it in the first 48 hours did not fully capture. The woman standing at that podium did not laugh. She did not pump her fist. She did not look at her family. She did not do any of the things that people do when they are surprised by their own success. She stood with her hands loose at her sides, her chin level, and she watched Steve Harvey knock on the board with the calm expression of a woman who had known, long before she walked onto that stage, exactly what was going to happen. The question the audience would carry home that evening, the question that would sit with them at dinner and come back to them in the dark before sleep, was not how a woman could be that good. The question was what it cost her to stay that calm when someone tried to take it away. The Family Feud studio on a Thursday taping in early October had a particular atmosphere that regulars on the production team described as controlled chaos with good lighting. The warm-up comedian had been on stage since 8:30 in the morning, running the 200-person audience through call and response drills, teaching them the rhythms of when to clap and when to hold their breath and when to react, as if emotion were a skill that could be rehearsed. The truth was, it could not. What happened in that room on that particular Thursday in October was not the product of a warm-up comedian. It was not the product of stage direction or lighting cues or any of the 100 invisible hands that went into making 60 minutes of television look effortless. It was the product of one woman who had decided, a long time ago, to be ready. Steve Harvey walked out at 10:14 in the morning in a deep navy suit with a pocket square the precise shade of old gold. His shoes were so polished they caught the studio lights and threw small coins of brightness onto the ceiling. He shook hands across the front 2 rows like a man genuinely pleased to be here, because he was. After everything, the sketch shows, the radio years, the talk show, the hosting gigs, Family Feud had become the place where Steve Harvey was most fully himself. Not the performer. The man, the one who had grown up in Cleveland watching his mother make something from nothing. The one who had slept in his car while building a comedy career. The one who understood, at a level that was not intellectual but cellular, what it meant to be told you were not enough, and then go out and be exactly enough anyway. That understanding lived in the way he looked at contestants. He did not look through them. He looked at them. Every single one. You in the Houston sweatshirt, Steve said, pointing at a man in the 3rd row. You wore that on purpose. That's intentional. That's a statement. The man grinned and nodded. I respect it, Steve said. Commitment is its own reward. He looked around. Where did everybody come from today? Hands went up across the audience. Mobile, Alabama, Des Moines. A couple from outside Toledo who had driven through the night and arrived at 6 a.m. and were running entirely on coffee and the specific energy of people who had promised themselves an experience. The grandmother from Mobile, in the fourth row, had a sign, hand-painted, yellow background. It read, "Mama came all this way, Steve, don't let her down." The letters were slightly uneven, the kind of sign made the night before at a kitchen table with craft paint and too much love. Steve saw it and pressed his hand to his chest. "Mama," he said, "you are not going home disappointed. I promise you that." He meant it as a general pleasantry. He had no idea yet just how precisely that promise would be kept. Two families stood on either side of the stage, separated by the board and by the particular electricity of people who have traveled a long way to compete and do not intend to lose. On the left side stood the Calloway family from Spokane, Washington, 5 members. Loud, joyful, and organized the way families are organized when there is one person in the center of them who has been running things for a long time. That person was Gene Calloway, 61 years old, retired firefighter, 6'4", and built like he had never stopped fighting fires even after he turned in his gear. He had a big handshake and a bigger laugh, and the comfortable authority of a man who had spent 32 years walking into burning buildings and coming out the other side, which had given him, among other things, an unshakable belief in his own judgment. His daughters, Renee and Cheryl, 34 and 31, stood on either side of him like bookends, finishing each other's sentences in the effortless way of siblings who have spent a lifetime in the same rooms. His wife Barbara was small and precise and had already identified during the pre-show which camera she was most likely to end up on. His youngest, Marcus, 28 and the quietest of the group, stood at the end of the row and looked like he was doing mental preparation. The Calloways had prepared. They had watched 40 episodes online. They had practiced buzzing in fast. They were not here by accident. On the right side of the stage stood the Adeyemi family from Sioux Falls, South Dakota. 4 members, and from the first moment they walked out onto that stage, something was different about them. Not in a flashy way, not in a look-at-us way. Just different. Quieter, more deliberate. A father who stood with his hands loosely clasped and his shoulders perfectly even. 2 teenage boys who were trying to look cool and mostly succeeding except for the way their eyes kept moving around the studio, taking everything in. Because they were 16 and 14, and this was extraordinary even if they would never admit it. And at the center of them, the woman who had gathered them all here. Imani Adeyemi, 41 years old. She stood at the podium with her hands at her sides and her chin level, and an expression that was warm but not eager, present but not anxious. She looked like a woman who had arrived exactly where she intended to be. Steve Harvey walked over and looked at her card. "Imani Adeyemi," he said. "Yes," she said. "Sioux Falls, South Dakota." "That's correct." He paused for just a beat. Something about the precision of her answers to statements that were not technically questions had caught his attention. "What do you do for a living?" he asked. "Pediatric nurse practitioner," she said. 11 years. "Children's medicine," Steve said. "Children," she confirmed. "And their families, which is often the harder part." He looked at her again, longer this time. "Why is that the harder part?" "Because the child just needs you to fix something," she said. "The family needs you to fix their world. Those are different problems." Steve Harvey nodded very slowly. He had interviewed thousands of contestants. He had heard hundreds of answers to the question of what do you do. Most of them were beginnings of a conversation. Hers felt like a window. "How long have you been in Sioux Falls?" he asked. 19 years, she said. "I came from Lagos for nursing school. I stayed." "Nigeria to South Dakota," Steve said. "That's a journey." "It is," she said. "I recommend it." He laughed, a real laugh, not a host laugh. "You recommend leaving Lagos for Sioux Falls?" I recommend going exactly where you're supposed to go, she said, even when it surprises people. Steve Harvey looked at her one more time. He filed that sentence somewhere in the back of his mind, where he kept the things that turned out to matter. All right, he said to the audience. Let's play the feud. Imani Adeyemi had come to the United States from Lagos, Nigeria in August of 2003. At the age of 19, on a nursing scholarship to a small college in Iowa City. She arrived with 2 pieces of checked luggage, a carry-on bag that was technically over the weight limit but that the gate agent had waved through, and a laminated card that her mother had pressed into her palm at the airport as the line for departures began to move. The card was the size of a playing card. Thick stock, laminated twice, her mother had done it herself with a machine she had borrowed from the church office, and then done it again because the first lamination had trapped a small air bubble, and that was not acceptable. The edges were perfectly even. It had taken her mother 45 minutes to get the lamination right, which was exactly the amount of time Imani spent clearing security and sitting at the gate before her flight was called. On one side of the card was a Bible verse, Proverbs 31:25. Her mother's faith was not background noise, it was architecture. It shaped everything she built. On the other side, in her mother's handwriting, small and precise. The handwriting of a woman who had been a secondary school administrator for 26 years and had long ago decided that if something was worth writing, it was worth writing correctly, was a single sentence in Yoruba. M then and teal. M jkanikan jkggbb pkeb. Imani had translated it for her husband on their first date. They had been sitting across from each other at a restaurant in Sioux Falls that he had chosen because it was nice, but not too nice, which he had calculated would communicate interest without pressure, a calculation she had seen through immediately and found endearing. What does it mean? He had said, leaning forward. She had looked at him across the table and said, It means, you already know the answer. Don't let anyone convince you that you don't. He had been quiet for a moment. Then he had picked up a cocktail napkin from the table, taken a pen from his jacket, which he carried because he was the kind of man who still carried a pen, and written those words down in his careful, slightly left-leaning handwriting. He had folded the napkin and put it in his wallet. It was still there, worn soft at the folds now, the ink slightly faded, but still legible, still there, tucked behind his driver's license in the front pocket of the wallet that was currently in the back pocket of the jeans he was wearing in the family section of the Family Feud studio on a Thursday morning in early October. Tobias Adeyemi was 43 years old and had grown up in Sioux Falls and had never left South Dakota until the age of 26, when he drove to a hospital staff appreciation event in Iowa City because a friend had canceled and he had already rented a car. He had met Imani that evening. He had driven home the next morning understanding, in a way he had not understood anything before, that his whole life prior to that evening had been a kind of prologue. They had been married for 15 years. Their sons, Kolade, 16, and Deo, 14, were currently standing in the family section of the studio trying very hard to look like this was a normal day and not entirely succeeding. Deo had already been photographed by an audience member who recognized that he was photogenic and had that quality certain teenagers have of not knowing it yet, which makes it even more true. Kolade was reading the overhead screens between takes with the focus of someone who was memorizing the set for later reference, which he was. Imani had told them about the show in early September. She had sat them down at the kitchen table, a round table, 4 chairs, the same table where she had drilled them on biology homework and geography capitals and, in the last 3 weeks, on Family Feud survey answers, and she had said, "We've been selected to tape an episode. Thursday, October, I need you both to be available. Are we going to win?" Deo had asked. "Yes," she said. Not with bravado. The way she said everything important. She had started preparing the moment the application was confirmed. She had always believed, not arrogantly but practically, the way a nurse practitioner believes in evidence, that most outcomes were the result of preparation, meeting an opportunity. The opportunity was arriving. The preparation was her responsibility. She had surveyed 40 people, friends, colleagues, the night shift nurses at the clinic who came into the break room at 3 a.m. and found a piece of paper on the table that said, "Quick survey." What would you say if someone asked you to name something you always find in a grandmother's purse? She had surveyed the parents in the waiting room, with permission, on slow afternoons. She had asked her husband's co-workers. She had asked the man who delivered supplies to the clinic every Tuesday, whose name was Harold, and who had been doing it for 17 years, and who had, it turned out, extremely strong opinions about what people name when they think of a summer barbecue. She had recorded every response in a small spiral notebook, green cover, the kind that cost 99 cents at a drugstore. She had filled 16 pages. Then she had distilled it, found the patterns. The first answers people give when they do not think carefully versus the answers they give when they do, the gap between what people say they would answer and what they actually say under pressure. The questions that sound easy and trick you into an obvious answer that turns out not to be the most common one. She had memorized her notes in the final week. She left the notebook at home on Thursday morning because she did not need it anymore. She had learned, a long time ago, that the most dangerous thing a prepared person can do is hold their notes in their hands when the moment comes. Your hands should be free. Your mind should be clear. You should have done the work early enough that by the time the moment arrives, you are not working. You are simply knowing. Her mother had taught her that. Her mother, Adenola, was 67 years old and lived in the same house in Lagos where Imani had grown up, in a neighborhood where the streets flooded slightly in the rainy season, and the neighbors had known each other for 30 years, and the church was 2 blocks away, and had been for as long as anyone could remember. She had been a secondary school administrator for 26 years, and was now retired, which meant she had transferred her administrative energy entirely to her family, her church, and a community reading program she had started with 3 other women from her congregation. She was at this moment 7 time zones ahead of her daughter. It was past 2 in the morning in Lagos. She was not asleep. The first round face-off began at 10:22. Steve Harvey stood between Imani Adeyemi and Jean Calloway at center stage. Jean was a full head taller than her. He had the wide, planted stance of a man who took up space by nature and had never thought to do otherwise. Imani stood with her hands at the buzzer and her eyes on Steve Harvey's face. She was not watching the board. She was watching him. She had noticed during the pre-game warm-up that Steve Harvey's right shoulder dropped slightly, just slightly, a half second before he started reading the question. She did not analyze this consciously. She registered it the way a practitioner registers the small tells of a patient's body. Information, name something a person does to kill time at an airport, Steve said. Jean's hand moved toward the buzzer. Imani's had already pressed it. Phone, she said. The board revealed. Number 1 answer. 47 points. Jean Calloway looked at the buzzer, then at his hand, then at Imani. He was not angry. He was genuinely puzzled. He had been fast. He knew he had been fast. She had simply been faster. The Adeyemis played the round. Imani gave the signal and her sons answered in turn. Kolade with eat for 19 points. Deo with walk around for 12. Tobias called read a book from the family section, which came in at 8, and Jean's family let out the collective groan of people who recognize a solid answer they hadn't thought of fast enough. Final score, 86-61, Adeyemi's win. Second round. Jean rolled his shoulders before the face-off. A habit from sports, probably, a way of settling himself and signaling that the last result was a data point, not a verdict. Name something you'd find on a doctor's desk. Imani's buzzer, before the question was fully finished. Clock, she said. Number one answer, 38 points. The audience made a sound. Steve Harvey turned to the board, looked at it, then turned back to her. He pointed at her, not accusatorially. The way you point at someone when you have just seen a magic trick and you have not yet decided whether you want to know how it works. Hold on, he said. I'm right here, she said. That was fast, he said. The clock was the obvious answer, she said. Time is the only thing a doctor is always running out of. Steve Harvey looked at the audience for confirmation that they had also heard this. They had. She said that like she thought of it 10 years ago, a woman in the 5th row said to her husband. Her husband nodded. The Adeyemis played the round. Imani directed her family with quiet precision. A slight nod when Kalade hesitated between two answers, a small tilt of her head that Deo, who knew his mother, interpreted correctly as you're overthinking it, just say the first thing, and they swept the round cleanly. It was during the break between rounds 2 and 3 that Gene Calloway leaned toward his daughter Renee and said, in a voice that was lower than he probably intended but not low enough for the microphones to miss, "She's just getting lucky." Renee patted his arm and did not respond. Imani, 5 feet away and facing the board, did not react. But she had heard it. She had been hearing variations of that sentence for 22 years. She had heard it in nursing school when she answered a clinical question correctly on the first day, and her professor, a man who had been teaching for 19 years and who wore the same 3 sport coats in rotation, and who was, she came to understand, genuinely good at his job but had a particular blind spot, had said, "Lucky guess," and moved on. She had heard it at her first hospital review board, when she correctly identified a diagnosis that 2 more senior practitioners had missed, and a colleague had said afterward, in the hallway, not knowing she was still within earshot, "She got fortunate with that one." She had heard it from a patient's father once, who had asked her, after she had told him his daughter's condition was not as serious as the ER had suggested, and here was why, how long she had been practicing. 11 years, she said. He looked relieved, and then immediately looked slightly uncertain, and she could see him recalculating something in his head. She had learned to see that recalculation. It happened in a very specific way. The face settled into a kind of surprised compliance, as if her competence was a pleasant shock rather than an expected thing. She did not carry bitterness about this. She had considered it early on, when she was younger and still in the phase of her life where she had to decide how much of her energy to spend on resentment versus how much to spend on excellence. The decision had not been difficult. Excellence was more expensive, but it compounded. Resentment was cheap and lost value over time. She chose excellence. And she came to this game show prepared to demonstrate it so clearly that there would be no remaining argument. Round 3 was beginning. Gene Calloway rolled his shoulders again. Something in the studio had started to shift. The audience could feel it. Not in the way you feel a temperature change, not that gradual. More like the way the air changes right before something breaks. A pressurization. An anticipation with no specific shape yet. The Calloway family had come here to win. Gene had 32 years of running into burning buildings. His daughters had prepared. His wife had studied the camera angles. They were not a family that expected to lose. And yet, round by round, something was happening at the other podium that they did not have a word for. Round 3 face-off. Name a reason someone might call in sick when they're not really sick. Imani's buzzer. Before the last syllable. Mental health day, she said. The board flipped. Number 1 answer. 51 points. Steve Harvey raised both eyebrows at once. Mental health day, he repeated. It's the number 1 reason, and it's the one people are most embarrassed to admit, Imani said. which is why the survey answer is so high. People recognize themselves in it. The audience responded with the particular sound of 200 people simultaneously recognizing themselves in something. She just explained the methodology, Steve Harvey said to no one in particular. The Adeyemis played the round. Imani's sons were warmed up now, the stage fright had burned off, and what was underneath was something more interesting. Kolade, who had been quiet all morning, answered with dentist appointment, and when Steve told him it was on the board for 18 points, he nodded once with the contained satisfaction of a boy whose mother had surveyed 40 people in order to prepare him for this exact moment. Deo said hangover, then immediately looked at his mother with enormous eyes, as if he had committed an error. Imani's expression did not change. The board showed it for 22 points. Deo exhaled. Tobias, from the family section, said just tired in a tone of voice that suggested this was personal. It was on the board for 31 points. The audience cheered. Round 3. Adeyemis, Steve Harvey turned to the audience. I want everybody to count with me. 1. He held up a finger. 2. Another. 3. 3 rounds. 3 face-offs. 3 number 1 answers. 3. He turned and looked at Imani directly. What is happening over here? I'm answering questions, she said. You are, he said, very correctly, very quickly, with explanation. The explanation is a bonus, she said. The answer is the point. You study for this? Steve asked. I study for everything, she said. It's a professional habit. 41 years old, Steve said, looking at the card again. Nurse practitioner. 11 years. Correct. What does a nurse practitioner do when she studies for a game show? She surveys 40 people, Imani said. She records their answers. She identifies the patterns. She notes the difference between what people say they'd answer and what they'd actually say under pressure. She distills the data. She memorizes it. A pause. And then she comes to the show. There was a moment of pure, perfect silence. Then the audience began to clap. Not the polite approval clap of a studio audience responding to a cue. The other kind. The kind that builds from one person and pulls the rest along. Gene Calloway was not clapping. He was standing 4 feet away with his arms folded and an expression that had traveled over the last 3 rounds. From surprise to recalibration to something that was now, honestly, starting to look like resistance. He had spent 32 years being the person in the room who knew how things worked. Burning buildings had hierarchies. Firehouses had hierarchies. His family had a hierarchy that everyone understood and no one discussed. He was not accustomed to being outpaced. And he was finding, with growing discomfort, that he could not identify a category for what was happening to him, because it wasn't that the other team was playing better in the ways he'd expected. It was that the woman on the other side was operating on a level he had not anticipated and could not, quite, make peace with. Round 4 face-off. Name a job where you'd need to stay calm under pressure. Imani's buzzer. Nurse, she said. The audience did a thing that was half laugh and half cheer. A sound that does not have a clean name, but that means of course. Of course it does. Number 1 answer. 54 points. Steve Harvey looked at the board. He looked at Imani. He looked at the board again. He tilted his head. He did it slowly, the way a man tilts his head when he is genuinely trying to see something from a different angle to determine if it's as real as it looks. Nurse, he said. Nurse, she confirmed. Because you're a nurse. Because it was the number 1 answer, she said. That I happen to also be. So you answered from experience and from the survey simultaneously. They agreed, she said. That's how you know you got it right. He pointed at her. See, now you are showing off. I am being efficient, she said. There is a difference. The studio broke. Not just laughter, something fuller than that. The audience was cheering and laughing at the same time. The way people respond when they are watching someone do something at a level that makes them feel good about human beings generally. And it was in the middle of this, in the noise and the warmth and the momentum of 4 rounds of perfection, that Gene Calloway said the thing. He did not shout it. That was important. He said it quietly. The way you say something you have been thinking for a while and have finally said out loud because the noise in the room gave you cover. He said it to his daughter, who was standing right next to him, who turned and looked at him with an expression that immediately communicated, "Don't." Too late. She must have had the questions in advance. Every sound in that room stopped. Not gradually, not with a ripple. All at once, the way a candle goes out. Steve Harvey went still, not dramatically, not with a sharp intake of breath or a theatrical pause. He went still the way a man goes still when he has heard something that requires a moment to process correctly, to make sure he heard it right, and then to make sure he responds to it right. He was still holding his note card. He was still at center stage. He looked at Gene Calloway. Gene's daughter Renee had already taken a small step sideways, not away from him, just enough to mark that what he had said was his alone. "Say that again," Steve Harvey said. Quietly, Gene's expression did the thing that expressions do when a private thought has been dragged into a room where it has to survive on its own. He held up both hands, palms out, the universal gesture of a man trying to walk something back before it reaches him. I didn't mean. What did you mean?" Steve said. Same tone, not raised, not performed. The way a man speaks when he is past performance and into something real. There was a microphone on the podium between them and a microphone clipped to Gene's lapel and 200 people in a studio with very good acoustics and not a single one of them breathing right now. Gene looked at the floor for a moment. Then he looked up. It's 4 rounds. And every time. First answer, number 1, I just thought. You thought. What? Steve said. He was not being cruel. He was being precise. The difference mattered. I thought it wasn't possible, Gene said. It not being possible, Steve said slowly, and her having the questions in advance, those are 2 different things. Gene nodded. Once small, one of them, Steve said, is doubt. The other one is an accusation. The word accusation landed in the room like something with weight. Imani Adeyemi stood at her podium through all of this without moving. She was not performing stillness. It was not an act. She had practiced this. Not this specific moment. She had not anticipated Gene Calloway, had not known his name before today, had no reason to expect that someone would accuse her on live television of cheating her way to the answers she had simply known. But she had practiced the principle. The principle was, you do not spend your composure on the person who doubts you. You spend it on the next correct answer. She had learned this gradually, over years. The first time someone had called her a lucky guesser, she had been 20 years old, and the wound had gone all the way down. She had sat with it for 3 days. She had cried, once, quietly, in a bathroom at the nursing school. And then she had washed her face, and come out, and gotten the next exam question right, and the one after that, and the one after that. By the time she was 30, the wound did not go as deep. By 35, it did not take 3 days to recover. By 41, standing on a television stage in front of 200 people and 2 million eventual viewers, it did not touch her at all. That was not numbness. That was what 22 years of choosing excellence over resentment looked like from the outside. She had one thought, standing there while Steve Harvey held Gene Calloway to account. She thought, the next answer is the response. Steve Harvey turned away from Gene. He looked at the executive producer at the edge of the stage. He looked back at the audience, at the 200 people who were holding their collective breath so hard the room had a pressure to it. He made a decision. "I want to try something," he said. Not to Jean, to the room. "I want to ask her one more question. Right now. Live on this stage." He looked toward his producer. "Bring me a card she has never seen." The studio went from tense to electric. A segment producer came out from the wings carrying a sealed card, the kind used for exactly this kind of moment. Questions that had never been scheduled, held back for circumstances that required proof. She handed it to Steve without making eye contact with anyone, the way professionals do when they know the camera is on everything. Steve took the card. He looked at it. He nodded once, to himself. He walked to the center of the stage. He looked at Imani Adeyemi. She met his eyes. She was ready. She had been ready. Steve Harvey held up the card. He did not read it fast. He read it clearly, with the weight of a man who understood that this was no longer about a game show and had not been for several minutes. "We asked 100 people," Steve said. "Name something a mother always seems to know, even when nobody told her." The audience had gone quiet again. A different kind of quiet than before. Before it had been shock. This was something closer to witnessing. Imani Adeyemi looked at Steve Harvey. She did not look at the board. She did not look at Jean Calloway. She did not look at her husband in the family section, though she could feel him, the specific quality of his attention, the way it always felt like a hand on her shoulder even from across a room. She looked at Steve Harvey and she said 2 words. "When you're lying." Steve turned to the board. The board revealed it. Number 1 answer. 67 points. And then, the moment happened. The moment that 2 million people would share in 48 hours. The moment that nurses in Birmingham and Lagos and Manchester would send to each other at midnight. The moment that the grandmother from Mobile in the 4th row would describe to everyone she knew for the next 6 months. Steve Harvey walked to the board. He stood in front of it. He looked at the screen. He looked at the number. He looked at the flashing lights that accompanied a number 1 answer. He raised his right hand. He knocked on the board. 3 times. Knock, 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 the sound of a man checking whether the wall is real. He stepped back. He stood with his hands on his hips, and he shook his head slowly, the particular way a man shakes his head when he is amused and amazed and slightly undone all at once. "Y'all," he said. He was talking to the audience but also to himself, and also to the general universe which had arranged for this to happen on a Thursday morning in October. "Y'all, I need somebody to come look at this board, because what is happening up here is not possible." The audience was on its feet. The floor manager appeared at the edge of the stage, genuinely uncertain whether something had malfunctioned. "I'm fine," Steve told him, waving him off. "The board is fine. That's the problem. The board is fine." He turned back to the audience. "Everything is working correctly." Which means, she did that. Again, he turned to Imani. She was smiling now. Not the controlled, professional smile of the earlier rounds. A real one. The kind that takes over your face before you can manage it. The kind that means something is true. "How?" Steve said. Just that. One word. How? The question of a man who has been in this business for 20 years and thought he had seen the edge of what was possible, and has just discovered there is more beyond it. "I paid attention," she said, "to people. For a long time." "That's it?" he said. "And I studied," she said. "I surveyed 40 people. My husband, my colleagues, the parents in my waiting room, with their permission, the night shift nurses. Harold, who delivers our medical supplies on Tuesdays, he had very specific opinions about summer barbecues." She paused. "I asked everyone. I recorded it. I found the patterns. And I memorized them." She said it plainly. "Without performance. The way you describe a process that worked. Steve Harvey looked at her for a long moment. Then he turned slowly to Gene Calloway. Gene had not moved. He was standing in the same spot, and his face had gone through several things in the last 2 minutes, and had arrived at a place that was not comfortable, but was at least honest. She studied, Steve said to Gene. Still quiet. Still measured. 3 weeks of preparation. 40 people surveyed. The answers memorized. He paused. She didn't need the questions in advance. She was just more prepared than anyone else in this room. He said it without cruelty. But he said it. The room understood what had happened, not just what Gene had said, but what Gene had assumed, why he had assumed it, and what it meant that he had been wrong. Gene was quiet for a moment. Then he did something that no one had quite expected. He turned to Imani Adeyemi and he looked her in the eye, not at the floor, not at Steve, not at the camera, directly at her. And he said, I owe you an apology. I was wrong to say that. And I'm sorry. The room took a breath. Imani looked at him. I accept your apology, she said. Clear, and without hesitation, and without any performance of graciousness that was not already simply how she was. Thank you for saying it. Gene Calloway nodded. He looked like a man who had aged slightly in the last 10 minutes and was not entirely sure that was a bad thing. The show continued. It had to. There were cameras rolling and a schedule and a network that expected 60 minutes of programming. The world that the Calloways and the Adeyemis had briefly shared. The small world of that studio on that morning had to fold itself back into the structure of a game show, which it did, imperfectly and warmly, and with the specific awkwardness of a thing that has been more real than it was supposed to be. The Adeyemis won the remaining rounds, not dramatically, just consistently, the same way they had won the first 4. Imani answered, her family answered. The points accumulated the way points accumulate when the person driving knows the route. They reached fast money with a combined score that was not the highest in the show's recent history, but was, in the opinion of 3 producers independently, and later, one of the most earned. Fast money was Imani and Tobias. Tobias went first. He had 60 seconds and 5 questions, and the particular expression of a man who has been watching his wife be extraordinary all morning, and is now acutely aware that he is about to stand in the same spot and be evaluated by the same standard. He answered all 5 in 53 seconds. He said pizza to a question about food, and then immediately said, wait, no. No, and the buzzer had already moved on. He said the garage with enormous confidence to a question about where men hide things from their wives, and received a roar of recognition from the male portion of the audience, and 28 points from the board. He guessed well on 3, and perfectly on 1, and his final score was 141 points. His sons gave him a standing ovation from the family section. Deo was clapping over his head. Kolade had a look on his face that communicated deep respect delivered through studied nonchalance. Then Imani stepped up. The studio had a particular quality of attention now. The kind of attention that is not about entertainment anymore. Everyone in that room had spent the morning watching this woman, and they knew, without being able to articulate exactly why, that something was about to happen that was worth watching completely. Steve Harvey stood beside her with his timer. 60 seconds, he said. 5 questions. Don't repeat any of Tobias's answers. I know, she said. He looked at her. I know you know, he said. He almost smiled. I just have to say it. Of course, she said. Ready? Yes, the timer started. Imani Adeyemi answered all 5 questions in 31 seconds. She did not repeat a single answer from Tobias. She did not hesitate. Not once. Not between questions, not mid-answer, not in the space where most people's eyes go slightly unfocused as they search for something. She did not search. She retrieved. Her score, 157 points. Combined total, 298 points. The Adeyemi family had won $25,000. The audience gave them a standing ovation that was not really about $25,000. It was about the morning. It was about what they had seen and what it meant, and the specific satisfaction of watching someone be so thoroughly, undeniably, publicly correct that there was nothing left to argue about. Tobias met his wife at the edge of the stage. He had been in the family section for the fast money round, and now he was walking toward her with an expression that was trying to be composed and losing the battle. He took both her hands. He opened his mouth. He closed it. He said, "You." She laughed. "That's it? 11 years of marriage, and I get you?" "You," he said again. "Just you." Their sons arrived from the family section, still technically trying to look cool, now completely failing. Deo wrapped his arms around his mother without preamble. Kolade stood beside her and put his hand on her shoulder, the gesture of a 16-year-old boy who is not yet ready to hug in public but needs the contact, and looked at her with an expression that she would remember for the rest of her life. Steve Harvey gave them a moment. He stood at the edge of the stage and watched this family, and he did not speak because there was nothing to say yet, and he had been doing this long enough to know when words were required and when they were not. Then, when the moment had breathed long enough, he walked over. He stood in front of Imani Adeyemi. "Can I ask you something?" he said. When he said it, the questions in advance, what were you thinking in that moment? What was going through your mind? Imani was quiet for a beat. It was not a hesitant quiet. It was the quiet of a woman choosing the right words, which she always did. "I was thinking," she said, "that I had heard it before, that I will probably hear it again, that the answer to it would not come from what I said." She looked at the board, still lit, still showing her scores, the numbers sitting there solid and true. It was going to come from the next answer I gave. Steve Harvey looked at her. "That's the discipline," he said. "Yes," she said. "Who taught you that?" She reached into the pocket of her blazer. She brought out a small laminated card, the size of a playing card, worn at the corners. The laminate slightly yellowed at one edge. She had carried it for 22 years. She had carried it through nursing school and through hospital corridors, and through every examination and every board review and every moment when someone's expression had told her they were surprised that she was right. She held it up. Steve Harvey looked at it. He could not read it from where he stood. The print was small and the card was old, but he could see that it was something that had been carried a long time. "What does it say?" "On one side," she said, "is Proverbs 31:25. My mother's faith." She turned the card. "On this side, in my mother's handwriting. In Yoruba." She paused. "It says, you already know the answer. Don't let anyone convince you that you don't." The room was very quiet. Steve Harvey pressed his lips together and breathed in through his nose, not performing emotion, actually managing it. He looked at the audience. "That," he said. His voice was slightly different now. Lower, more careful, the voice he used when he stopped being a host and started being a person. "That is what I needed somebody to say in this room today." He turned back to Imani. "Your mother is a wise woman," he said. "She still is," Imani said. "She's in Lagos right now. It's past 2 in the morning there." Something moved across Steve Harvey's face that was not a smile and was not sadness. It was something in between, the expression of a man who has been reminded of something large. "She stayed up to watch," he said. "She always stays up," Imani said. "She has never missed a moment she could be present for." In the second row of the audience, a woman pressed both hands flat against her chest and breathed. In the fourth row, The grandmother from Mobile with the hand-painted sign was not looking at the sign anymore. She was looking at Imani Adeyemi, and her eyes were wet and she was nodding slowly, the nod of a woman who understands the language of what had just been said, even if she has never met the person saying it. Steve Harvey looked at his note card one last time. He did not read from it. He put it in his jacket pocket. "Let me tell you something," he said. He was not performing now. He had moved past that completely. "I have done this long enough to know that most things on television are built. They are planned and written and staged and lit and approved in a conference room somewhere and then assembled in a studio to look like they are happening for the first time." He looked around the room. What happened here today was not that. He paused. This was a woman who decided to be so prepared that doubt would not have anywhere to land. He looked at Imani. And when the doubt came anyway, because doubt is not always reasonable, it does not always wait for evidence, sometimes it arrives before the facts and stays after they are disproven, when it came. She did not fight it. He paused. She answered the next question. He let that sit. "The card says it better than I can," he said. "You already know the answer. Don't let anyone convince you that you don't." He looked at the audience. He looked at the Calloway family on the other side of the stage, at Jean, who was standing very still, at Renee, who was looking at her father with an expression of complicated love. He looked at the two Adeyemi boys with their mother's composure and their father's warmth. "That is what I want you to take home from today," Steve said. "Whatever you came here to see, funny moments, points on a board, a good time on a Thursday, I hope you got that too. But I want you to take that sentence home with you. Because somebody prepared it for 22 years and carried it 3,000 miles so that this room could hear it." The episode aired 6 weeks after the Thursday in October when it was taped. It went up on a Wednesday evening, in the usual time slot, between a local news broadcast and a prime-time procedural that had been running for 11 seasons. The Family Feud production team had flagged the episode in their internal notes as one to pay attention to, but they had been careful, because they had been wrong before about what would travel and what would stay contained to its original audience. They were not wrong this time. Within 12 hours of airing, a clip had been posted online. Not the full episode, just the 43 seconds of Steve Harvey knocking on the board and looking at Imani and saying y'all with the specific bewilderment of a man who has run out of language. Within 24 hours the clip had 2 million views. Within 48 hours it had been shared by nurses. That was the specific thing the producers had not anticipated. Not by game show fans. Not primarily by people who loved Steve Harvey, though there were many of those. By nurses. Pediatric nurses in Birmingham who sent it to their department group chat at 11:30 at night. Night shift nurses in Houston who watched it on their phones in the break room at 3 a.m. and played it again. A nursing student in Manchester, England, 20 years old, Nigerian, studying through a scholarship, sitting at her desk in student housing at 7 in the morning, who watched it and printed the screenshot and taped it above her desk next to a photograph of her mother. The comments filled with nurses. Their stories. The times they had been asked to prove themselves twice. The times a patient's family had looked at them with the particular look that meant, "Are you sure?" The times they had answered every question correctly and someone had said, "Lucky guess, she just got fortunate, it's not possible." The times they had chosen, quietly and without announcement, to answer the next question instead. In Lagos, Adunola watched the episode at 2:14 in the morning on a phone propped against a sugar jar on her kitchen table. She had made herself tea. The tea had gone cold while she watched. She watched the fast money round. She watched the score. She watched $25,000 flash on a board 7 time zones away from her kitchen. She watched her daughter reach into the pocket of her blazer. She watched her daughter hold up the card. She watched from 3,000 miles away In the middle of the night, her daughter say, she still is. She watched a man on American television press his lips together and breathe. She watched the grandmother in the fourth row nod. She played it again from the beginning. She played it 4 times. The $25,000 was divided carefully and intentionally. A portion went into Kalade and Deo's college funds, the boys whose mother had spent 3 weeks drilling survey answers into them at the same kitchen table where she had drilled biology and geography, and the particular understanding that preparation is not what you do before a test. It is how you live. A portion went to the community clinic where Imani had volunteered for 6 years, to a fund that covered medical supplies for families who could not pay. Tobias made that donation himself, quietly, without telling anyone, and then told Imani, and she said, "I know. I knew you would." He had said, "Did you survey 40 people about that too?" She had said, "I didn't need to." Gene Calloway did not appear in the news coverage of the episode. He sent, 3 weeks after the episode aired, a handwritten note to the Family Feud production office. They forwarded it to Imani. It said, "I watched the episode back. I heard what I said and what it sounded like, and I am sorry. You earned every answer. You are a remarkable woman and I was wrong about you. I hope you'll accept this apology." Gene Calloway, Spokane. Imani read the note once. She folded it carefully. She placed it in the green spiral notebook with the ink-stained cover, the one with 16 pages of surveyed answers, the patterns and the data, Harold's opinions about summer barbecues, the night shift nurse's 3 a.m. intuitions, and she put it next to the last page. The last page had a heading at the top, in her handwriting. It said, "What people say when they doubt you." Below the heading, the page was blank. She had never needed to fill it in, because every time the doubt had come, she had already moved on to the next answer.